Hello and welcome to PolyCosm. My name is Christina and today we'll be doing shit Christina's never done before. I'm going to be testing out the texture paint tool in Blender, and I thought using our untextured insect buddy from a few side quest episodes ago would be perfect. If you haven't seen those videos, we basically just went over how to design an insect creature based on insect studies. I then took that final design, modeled it in Blender, and using Blender's particle system, I created a swarm. So today I'll take you guys through the process of unwrapping a low poly insect and how to paint that insect using Blender's texture paint tools. Let's get started. So I first just wanted to let you guys know I'm not a very good modeler or unwrap artist, especially unwrapping. Oh boy. If you're looking for unwrapping tips, I'd probably look to someone a bit more experienced. I'll mostly be covering the painting portion of things, as painting is actually what I do on a day-to-day basis. So you'll see me struggling to get acquainted with the tools, but hopefully you'll be able to get something out of this little bonus episode. Let's go over some basic unwrapping tips. When you select your model and go into the UV editing tab, the UVs will be super messy. You can start selecting faces of your model and you'll see that they appear on the left side. However, since we want distinct flat surfaces to draw on, we need the UVs to be separated and not piled on top of each other like they are right now. So to separate them, we need to choose specific parts, and with U, just make sure that you're in the right viewport and hovering over that, you get a few options. You'll have to unwrap parts of the mesh depending on its shape. Here's a little slide I actually put together to kind of demonstrate how to think about unwrapping. Unwrapping is essentially unpacking a texture, and we do this because it'll make it much easier to paint on the 3D model in texture paint. If you plan to paint in Photoshop, you should aim to make the unwraps as clear and organized as possible. Take this example in the bottom left. If you wanted to paint tiles along the edge of the cylinder here, it's much easier to do so on a straight surface like this one. So essentially you just have to go out and straighten out the vertices. There are tools and methods to do so, but I'm not going to be going over that today since we'll just be working in Blender the entire time and not Photoshop or any other software. So what do you do when you have something very complex like our insect buddy or a turtle mesh like this one? If you take note, there are red lines in a lot of places. And what exactly are those red lines, you ask? Well, they're basically just cut lines to kind of tell Blender where to cut the texture to make it easier to unwrap. Imagine you have a perfect paper cylinder without holes. If you try out the unwrapping tools, you'll end up with some really weird shapes. And the problem is a lot of these shapes are overlapping. So if you want specific details on the front, they'll most likely be mirrored on the back because of the overlap. So the way we solve this is to select all the edges that make up the top, right click and hit mark seam. Repeat this also for the bottom. If we now hit unwrap using the U button, the top and bottom are separated, but the cylinder portion just still doesn't look right. If you were to cut this with the scissor in real life, where would you cut it? Just along one of the edges, right? So just right click and hit mark seam. So now if you select everything and hit unwrap, it unwraps perfectly. And to show you what I mean, I'm going to create a color grid. Hit new to generate a new texture, choose your size, unhook alpha since we won't really be using that, and instead of blank, let's choose UV grid. Of course, nothing has happened, so we need to create a new material, and under the base color dot, let's add in an image texture. From the drop-down, choose the texture we just created. Now we actually have a great sense of how the unwrap is working. If these surfaces were really distorted, we'd know that we had done a very bad unwrapping job. If I actually choose the face on the left, I can scale and move it around with S and G. Another thing I wanted to mention is the bigger you make the unwrap on the UV grid, the more detail you'll be able to pack in that area. Although you should strive to have this grid be kind of like an equal size all over your model, and sometimes to do that you need to make the unwrap on your left either bigger or smaller. You'll understand better what I mean when I start unwrapping the insect. Which, speaking of, let's do that. Before we get to that though, I just want to let you observe the turtle example and see where they've added the seams to make the unwrapping a lot more seamless and clean. They chose to completely separate the legs and arms, the shell and the head. And just like with our cylinder, they chose to add a little cut line from the throat to the middle of the head to get a symmetrical unwrap. This is why you see those horrendously scary unwrapped faces, because the artist has most likely added a cut line there for symmetry's sake. So at first I was just trying to get my bearings. I'm not super experienced with unwrapping as I've explained before, so I just did what felt right and made sure all of the squares were of equal size on my model. You'll see me jump between a lot of different unwrapping modes like box unwrap, unwrap, smart UV unwrap, and so on. I would recommend just trying out the different ways to just learn what they do. For some parts, even when I'm painting, I'll go back and re-unwrap because I've realized I've done a terrible job. And it will become clear to you if you've done a bad job as well. You'll see why later on. So I'm basically just trying to fill out the grid while making the square sizes equal. If you can, try to make the islands, which is what each of these unwraps are called, as big on the grid as possible. Oh, and while you're unwrapping, make sure that you don't have any stragglers. Instead of hitting A on the right viewport to see all of the UVs, I highly recommend having these two arrows icons turned on at all times. That way you'll be able to see all of your UV unwraps without having to highlight surfaces on your model. So yeah, just make sure that when you zoom out, you don't see some accidental unwrapped pieces or bits that you've left behind. I made this mistake so much, so just learn from my mistakes, guys. Next is the fun part. So once you're happy with your unwrap, head to the texture paint tab and let's fill in our insect with a base color, which is this purpley color. Immediately you'll see the unwrapped islands filled in with a color. But we don't really want this grid anymore, so let's make a new texture instead. Press the X to unload the texture, and with new, let's double the resolution and choose blank this time. With the fill tool, let's repeat this action. Nothing is happening because we actually need to go to our material and choose our newly created texture again. And there we go. When I tried painting on my model with the paintbrush, I actually noticed that it was acting really weirdly, and this bugged me for ages. I just couldn't figure out what was happening. So I actually enabled face orientation and most of my model was red. That means that faces are actually flipped, so Blender thinks this model is inside out. So to fix that, I selected the red parts in edit mode, and under mesh and normals, I chose to flip the textures. And now it all turned blue. So we can disable the face orientation again, and if we paint, it's actually painting properly again. After that little adventure, I dragged in the reference image, which the design is actually based on, and I just started blocking in colors. Under the color palette, which you can access under the tool and workspace settings at the top here, you can basically just create a color palette and save colors. I highly recommend doing this because when you're painting with colors in Blender, the colors will kind of mix with the lighting setup that you have. So having those key colors saved will save you a lot of hassle. You can use the color picker, but it will never kind of capture the true color, if that makes sense. So just like you would do with any painting, you just start blocking in your base colors. And to get specific selections, all you need to do is to head from texture paint mode to edit mode, select some faces, and back in texture paint mode, make sure that this little icon is selected. That way everything else is masked out and you can only paint on those selected faces. I'll be using this function a lot. You can use Control Tab to easily switch modes instead of having to kind of go up to the bar all the time, but I personally haven't really developed that muscle memory for that yet, so I just use the button like a noob. So now that I've blocked out a lot of the main colors, I actually just started painting in the neon green color using the paintbrush. I chose to keep the strength at 1, which is equal to 100%, and basically just use the pen pressure on my tablet to get that nice fade. Although I have to say I'm not super impressed with the painting tools. It just feels super basic, and after coming from Photoshop, I don't know. I'm used to painting with super textured brushes. I know that you can get different types of textured brushes, but I doubt it would just feel as good. Beggars can't be choosers, can they? I still enjoyed painting on my model a lot. It just looked a bit messy, but then again, that might add to the stylized feeling, who knows? Also, there's something that you need to know. Whenever you're saving Blender while painting, you're actually not saving the texture file itself. You'll notice that the image here has a star next to it. That means that it isn't saved, so press that and hit save, or just press Alt-S. The worst thing in the world is to spend lots of time painting textures only to notice that, whoops, I didn't save. That would just suck so bad. I'll be time-lapsing a lot of the painting bits, but I thought I should explain my process a little bit more. Once all of the basic colors are blocked in, I tend to start focusing on the shadow and light. I'm leaving in detailing for last, but I just wanted to kind of figure out where I think shadows would occur if this was a bug in real life. Probably under the hard shell parts, right? So I started selecting those areas and with a big brush, painted in some shadows along the edges. I wanted a sort of stylized look, and if you look at, for example, World of Warcraft assets, a lot of the time they have a sort of uniform lighting scenario where the light isn't coming from like a specific direction, so you kind of get these shadows all along edges and the middle parts tend to be lit. This is the logic I used for my design as well. That way you can kind of put it into any game engine or lighting scenario and it will just work. You'll see me doing a lot of fake detailing, if I can call it that, like the area around the sockets in which the legs are being fed into. Instead of modeling this part, I'm choosing to paint it in to make it look like I've modeled that part. I'm sort of doing the same thing with the wings here. I could have modeled a part where the wing socket branched out towards the top of the wing and curved down, but I was trying to kind of keep the geometry of the insect really simple. If I were to actually make a bug for someone to see up close in a game, I'd go about creating this insect in a whole different way. Because it's supposed to be used for a simulation, I can't have crazy amounts of polys or the simulation would just kill my PC. So that's why I've decided to kind of let the texture take care of the detailing. Here is one of those parts where you can tell the unwrapping was done horribly. Painting on it just felt awful, so I had to re-unwrap this part in order to continue working on it. I think that's great though. That means your unwrap isn't exactly set in stone, and it's actually a really great learning opportunity to see what works and what doesn't. And here I actually noticed I totally had the wrong color despite having the reference on screen. Whoops. No biggie, I just changed the color and started working on the shading of the legs. I'm going to let the time lapse play out a little bit, but if you want to skip that, just jump to the timestamp on screen. Hello again. So I actually noticed that some parts were super difficult to paint. Our entire mesh was grouped into one big mesh, so to separate these parts, I selected the desired parts in edit mode, and with P I separated them. And with numpad / I could just paint freely. When I was done, I hit numpad / again and joined the two parts with Ctrl J. I also noticed that for some reason X symmetry wasn't working while I was painting, so I just found the painted version of the right legs on the UV texture and just moved the left leg unwraps over there. If you need to mirror any selections, you can select the entire selection with Ctrl L, and with Ctrl M and X, they'll be flipped along the X axis. Once I was happy with the medium details, I started working on the smaller details. I'm gonna let the time lapse play out for that too, so you can just jump forward to the next timestamp if you don't want to see it. And here we are! The last thing I wanted to do was to add an outline to make our creature look like something out of Borderlands, which is one of my favorite games. So I actually used the ink outliner texture from this pack, which we've actually featured on another side quest video in the past. I will link to both the pack and the video in the description and pinned comments. So yeah, let's play our little shape keys animation. Ah, I love that. It's so fun to see our creature just looking more alive. And now for the moment of truth, how will it look in the simulation? Let's turn it on. Yes, this is so awesome. Obviously you don't see any of the detailing that I just spent a lot of time doing, but that wasn't exactly the point of the video. Whew, that was another long one. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. I could have spent much longer painting on the creature, but I was a bit short on time, and yeah, hopefully you guys got the gist of it. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Bye!